Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon to you, wherever you are across the world. And welcome to this edition of the Global Markets Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick. Hi, Jim. I saw your
Morning,
video a
Ernest.
short while ago.
Good morning, Ernest. How are you?
Yeah, I'm fine, very good. But before we come to you, let me acknowledge our sponsors who have made this possible. And here I'm talking about the European Union, the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, OACPS, the GIS Move, Comcashew, USAID, Sustainable Nuts Initiative, and then your good self also, all Tinubu. Today, I know that we have only one more month to go to the end of the year. So what is becoming essential for us is the question of what key trends have you observed or have we observed in 2024, and how will these trends impact 2025? So, Jim Fitzpatrick, without much ado, I just leave the floor to you to walk us through some of these key trends that you observe, and also touch base and how they 20 touch base again also on the season in Tanzania and Mozambique, which is somewhere midway season, so that we know what also is happening. So on this note, floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Ernest. Hello, everyone. I'm back in Ireland. The winter's set in here. It's it's almost down to freezing here. I hope it's a little bit better where you are. So as we come toward the end of the year, a lot of people ask me, what do we see as the coming trends and what will make prices and what will make trade next year? So as Ernest said, I thought it'd be a good idea to let's have a look at some of the factors, some of the trends that we have experienced in the market in the last few weeks and over the course of 2024, and how they will influence trading conditions in January, February, and beyond that in 2025. It is a time of year where people are looking to make decisions. They're looking to plan their production. They're looking to plan their finance, particularly. And it is a difficult time to know whether or not to, for example, for a processor, do I make forward sales? Do I start to buy my raw cashew nuts if I'm in East Africa? Do I continue to buy raw cashew nuts if I'm in India or if I'm in Vietnam? And how will that pan out? And for how long will these current trends last? So what I thought we'd do, we'd have a look at some of these trends and we try and interweave the current market circumstances that discussion, so that we're talking about how the market's developing and also about these trends and how they'll influence next year as we go. So there are 10 trends, really there maybe a little bit more than that, but we've combined some of them together to use the time as well as we possibly can. Don't forget, if you've got any comments, any questions, which I will always welcome, don't forget, use the chat, raise your hand, and the moderators will get to you and invite you to speak, or just type your question into the chat if you're using Zoom, and we'll get to it at the end of the session. So let's go. Let's start to talk about some of the trends. And the first one is lower carryout stocks. So by this, I mean, what will be left at the end of the 2024 supply season for use in 2025. First thing we need to think about when we talk about carrying stocks is, what's the balance? What was the balance in 2024? So if we look at production, and you can see on your screen the production, and just particularly go back and note again the big step up as Cambodian production came online back in 20, and how that has kept production relatively high in the context of the previous decade ever since. This year, taking into account good crops in East Africa as they're coming in now and expected good crops to continue for the rest of the season in East Africa, but also in Brazil and also in Indonesia, I think production probably is down by something like 7%. It was more in West Africa, but it was largely balanced by increased production in Cambodia. So then if we apply our consumption pattern and a forecast for 2024, we're not entirely sure where 2024 will finish on consumption, but we have a pretty good idea at this stage. And when we look at that, we see lower production, but very strong demand in the course of the year. And that leads us to a situation where we're relatively well balanced. But the 3 previous years where we had surplus production in each case, especially 2022 and 2023, led to relatively high carry-in stocks, both of RCN and of kernels, in the big processing countries in India and in Vietnam. And to a large extent, 2022 and 2023, those stocks carried on and kept us going through 2024. And I'll come back a little bit to that in a moment. So this means that we have seen a situation where the market, although it has rightly increased in price, and it's significantly increased in price, as you know, although it's increased in price, demand remained very strong, and the carry-in stocks kind of carried us through the year, if you want to look at it like that. Now, if we look at our 2 main processing countries, firstly Vietnam, and we look at a relatively high opening stock, a modest crop, but again, that's the only kind of crop we seem to get in Vietnam these days. High imports, and these are the imports to the end of October, figures just released on Monday, 2.3 million tons. It's a big number. And it's augmented by big imports of Burma kernels, and that's an important trend, which I'll talk about a little bit later too. But the most significant move this year has been this remarkable increase in consumption. And trade into markets like the US, China, European Union, and into the Middle East has all been very, very strong. Add up the numbers as they stand, anticipating a little imports in November and into December, and we end up with what looks like a current stock balance of about 1.6 months of processing stock. That's based on the average monthly processing this year. 1.6 months from now is the 2nd of January. And that's when the stocks would carry us through. Now, if we look at the opening stock, when we talk about the opening stock, and it was a significant figure, we're talking about product that's custom cleared, entered Vietnam. It was augmented by a certain amount of transit stock, a certain amount of a float stock, which appears in the import figures. So Vietnam could carry out only about 1 month's supply of raw cashew nuts. It's a tight situation. It's the tightest it's been for many years. There will be a little bit of catch up. We notice that there's still material coming from Cote d'Ivoire and still material afloat from Guinea-Bissau due to the delays in shipments and the slower shipments that we've talked about many times. What we don't exactly know right now, how much that is. We don't exactly know how much is afloat and how much is in transit warehouses, if any. And the key factor in that is, of course, who owns that stock? Is it belonging to processors or traders? Are they strongholders? Are they weak? It seems logical that anyone carrying inventory toward the end of the year of raw cashew nuts would want to sell out, as it's unlikely that the current high prices, and you don't need a crystal ball to know that the current high prices are unlikely to be maintained once the Northern Hemisphere crop arrives from late January, February onwards. So a tight situation in Vietnam. Look at India, again, a strong carry-in stock, but a smaller crop. And I think I'm quite conservative on the crop at 600,000 tons. Perhaps it's a little bit bigger than that. I'm estimating India's imports will finish at about 1.1 million tons. Could be a touch higher than that. And that's based on the current figure. So the current official figure is 932,000 tonnes imported. Then we have a look at what was imported last year, and we're assuming that most of the material from Tanzania that has been bought will arrive during December. What hasn't yet been bought obviously won't arrive in December, that'll come into next year. We're thinking of process volume for the 12 months around about 1.8 million tonnes. So that includes primarily domestic consumption, of course, and that would allow for an increase in domestic consumption in India this year. Again, relatively conservative, I'm thinking around about 3 to 3.5%. Exports probably lower than last year, but exports are only a small part of the Indian cashew sector for the moment. That would leave India with about 330,000 tonnes, or about 2 months of processing stock at the end of the year. Again, fairly tight, significantly less than last year. And if we look at the imports, so here's the India's monthly imports. We have the official figures up to the end of September. We have unofficial figures for October, which is what leads me to my 1.1 million tonne estimate. And you can see that, generally speaking, in recent months, we have been around about where we were last year. A worse July, a better August, and September on par. I think October may be also slightly bigger than last year, but I don't think by too much. Last year, India imported 1.18 million tonnes. So we think 1.1 is not a big stretch. So this relatively tight situation, and particularly the absence of really high quality raw cashew nuts at this time of year, given that the material from Cote d'Ivoire is much lower quality this year, given that a lot of the West African raw cashew nuts have been lower quality, we've seen good support for the Tanzanian auction, and we've seen demand for early shipments. Now, there are questions around this. The good demand at the Tanzanian auction, about 280,000 tonnes already sold. How much of that has actually been sold to processors, and how much is in the hands of traders remains to be seen. And I'm hearing surprisingly low numbers in terms of what's already been sold. So it could well be that the stocks bought in Tanzania, some will go to Vietnam, most will go to India, but that they are actually in the hands of traders rather than processors, and that changes the dynamic quite a bit. We'll come back to that when we talk about Southern Hemisphere crops. So trend number one looks like lower carry-in stocks than we've seen in either of the past 2 years, and possibly the lowest carry-in stocks for some time. Second big trend, well, there's no surprise that we have a need to talk about the higher prices. What do higher prices mean in the market? So let's have a look. Where are we on higher prices? So here's our price chart. And what we're seeing is we've seen the largest price rise since 2016, when we had that really strong price trend and what turned out to be something of a disastrous price trend in the end, given what happened subsequently. But if we look at it, we are here and we're back toward prices that we haven't seen since 2021. So we're certainly at the upper end of the market when we look at pricing. And when we look a little bit closely at pricing and take some time maybe to think about this price trend. So what we've got here is we've got 5 years of price history, including 2024, and we have the high price for the year in blue. We have the low in red. We have the average price, so that's the monthly average FOB cashew kernels from the lowest priced origin, normally Vietnam. Average monthly over the year, and then we have the closing price. So what we're seeing in recent years, had the closing price 23, 22 and 21 has been below the average price for the year. end of 2024, the closing price is above the average price for the year. And that's an interesting development. And the gap between the closing price and the high price for the year, which I'm putting down as 360. I know the where price is slightly higher than that, but I'm using 360 because I don't think anything with much volume was traded above that price. So we're quite close. We're within 15 cents on the offered price. So 345 is an offered price in Vietnam today from certain processors. Others are higher. That's true. But I need to be consistent in the way we keep the records so the comparisons can be right. So we take 345 as a kind of a mid-range price for a forward contract. So what I normally do is I take, what can you buy for 3 months forward from a mid-range processor? And that's the price we use. If I were to use top-end processors, add another 10 cents at minimum onto that. If I were to use African processors, add 20 cents onto that for the FOB pricing. So we are today higher than the monthly average price to close the year out. There's no real reason to think that's going to change in the next 4 or 5 weeks. We are 40% above the low price. And we're asking the question, is this low price period, 2022, 2023 into early 2024, is that period over? If it is, how will demand react to it? And that's the key question. The prices, they should be workable. I know raw cashew nuts and kernels prices don't match today, but we'll talk about that shortly as well. So let's have a look at how demand has behaved over the years relative to price. The dotted line is our 320s FOB annual average price. So this is the average price at the end of each month. And the black line is the annual price, the annual demand growth. So here we're comparing by how much did demand grow or contract and price, to try and indicate how is demand influenced by changes in price. And what we can see immediately is that during this 2016, 2017 very high price period, that demand growth was flat. But we can also see that the change in trend didn't kick in immediately. But certainly we can conclude either high prices or price volatility were negative for demand. And I think it's price volatility has more of an impact actually than the high price. And I say that because as we get to the end of the period, post the volatile period, demand was at its lowest ebb. We had the lowest increase in demand. Interestingly, if we look in 2016, there was virtually no growth in worldwide demand as prices rose. So people were prepared for a difficult situation and they didn't increase. Now, we got to look carefully at the next period because we've got these two big disruptors. We've got the COVID, particularly early COVID in 2020, and we have from 2022 the war in Ukraine. So if we look at this relatively steady price period, we see quite volatile demand growth. We see, first of all, a drop during 2020 due to COVID, then a big increase and a spike 21 of, particularly in Europe and the United States, an impact of inflation on food and energy hit. We saw again a contraction in demand, followed by 2 years of pretty strong growth. 2023, 6.8% growth, 2024 so far, 8.6% growth. So that price increase does have an impact on demand. Let's look at some of the key markets that, again, dollars per pound FOB. The growth or decline in demand in any given year. And we have North America in red and Europe in blue. We just need to focus in on these two periods. So first of all, the period of relative price stability, during which we had strong demand growth, 2021, 2023, and again in 2024, but this was interrupted in 2022. If you recall, second half of 2022, exports to the United States virtually collapsed. Remarkably low level of export activity into the United States. Europe wasn't quite as bad, but we did get a fall in exports into Europe, much slower growth in that period. But that was due to inflation caused by the war by Russia on Ukraine. The earlier period when we had price volatility, again, we saw both of these markets behave much the same, pretty low demand. Now, these are significant markets. Between them, you're looking at somewhere in the region of 35 to 40% of world demand, depending on the year. And what we see is that the North American market, it appears to be more volatile. So the growth is up and down, depending on the conditions, depending on the economy, depending on price. But also we see that the US market reacts a little bit more quickly to changes in price. So if we go back to the stable price period way back in 2012 through to 2015, we see the US market demand growth happening more quickly than European growth. And we see the opposite. The US market declines more quickly. And this is interesting because in 2024, imports to the US so far are up by about 20. And we think that's going to finish a high number, probably somewhere in the high teens by the end of the year. So in Europe, we see a strong response in European demand to periods of price stability. We see generally a strong growth trend, but we see that this has been interrupted by the inflationary period, which is now easing and has been easing for some time. But the impacts on economies like the German economy, for example, have been quite strong. So we should expect on the basis of that next year, the US market may well react to the higher prices. Has it happened so far? Well, to a certain extent. Certainly people are more reluctant to make decisions on forward buying, and they will keep their forward buying under control. So would you, so would anyone, if you saw a 40% increase in the cost of raw material. It doesn't matter that the low price was too low and was always going to change. That's rarely taken into account by buyers. What they look at is, what was it last year? What is it this year? What's my budget? And they may well hesitate in anticipation of a bigger crop and some further changes in this, although I think they may be wrong if they expect prices to fall sharply. Let's look at other markets. So if we take China and India, so India, the world's largest market, and you can see the growth or decline in demand in India on the green line, and you can see China is the black line. Again, the red dotted line is our FOB prices. So looking at India, the most important market, you see steady growth. There is a bit of volatility based on the low ebb. Take out COVID. If we take out the 2020, first half of 2020 COVID impact, this line is relatively straightforward in terms of demand growth. So it does appear that India price volatility has a relatively limited impact. Indian consumers will buy cashews. They'll buy a little bit more when prices are low. They'll buy a little bit less when prices are high, but they will generally continue to buy cashews, and that's been evident over the years. China is a different story. So China is very volatile, and China demand can spike up as in 2019. It can grow very quickly as in 2023, and even 2024, although the growth has been less than 2023, it is phenomenal growth. And we are seeing the Chinese market grow very, very quickly. Now, we have also seen in the last 3 months, I've been looking at exports from Vietnam to China, and we have seen something of a slowdown. So the exports per month from Vietnam to China since prices have gone up, particularly since September, have been a little bit lower. Now, that could be due to other factors, but I think it is certainly affected by price. So higher prices are going to have a big impact in markets in 2025. We've looked at 4 markets and we're seeing each one reacts a little bit differently, but it would appear that the key reactions will be in the Chinese market and the US market. Between them, about 30% of world demand in those 2 markets based on 2024 figures. Third factor is the level of forward cover. So now we're talking about how much forward cover, how much buying for later delivery have kernels buyers around the world engaged in. So this means 2 things. It means, first of all, how much contracts have they got on their books? How much have they done? How much do they still need to do? But on the other hand, it also is an indicator as to how much has been sold, which of course means how much processors need to buy. And when we look at the market, we know that because processors must sell forward in order to achieve the orders, they start this season, generally speaking, particularly in Vietnam, they start the season in a short position and need to buy. So just let's have a look at this mechanisms. So we have, particularly in Western markets, particularly in Europe and North America, we have long contracts with supermarkets for forward positions. Some of them don't even have volume numbers on them. They have prices and they have parameters for the volume offtake. If you're covering forward contracts as an importer supplying a roaster, perhaps supplying onto a supermarket, or if you're a roaster buying directly, the number of suppliers that you can deal with is limited because there is a certain amount of risk in taking on a forward contract. If you take on a forward contract, for example, if you'd taken one on in November of 2023, you might have been able to buy around $2.50 from a good supplier, $2.45 from a less good supplier. Whether those contracts were delivered or not was a risk. And as we saw from April onwards, into May, into June, there were a lot of defaults on forward contracts because price had gone up by, at that stage, $1 a pound. That's $35,000 per container. It's a lot of money, and processors really struggled to deal with that, and therefore a lot of contracts were defaulted. The forward contracting also means that the suppliers, whether it's importers, processors, or traders, that they start the year short. In other words, they've sold, but they haven't bought. And therefore, there's an element of risk in there. Now, that doesn't mean that they will panic and come into the market. Not at all. They've been doing this for many, many years. But it does mean that, particularly for processors, because it is difficult to buy raw cashew nuts forward from reliable sources and very difficult to match your book, if you like, that you have enough bought to supply what you've sold. Very difficult to do that at this time of year, before the big crops in the Northern Hemisphere. So you start the year with a short position. And that's risk if the market goes against you. But in many cases, the mechanism for financing our industry is such that you need contracts to secure finance. So you, at this point in time, you're thinking about how many $1 million am I going to need to buy raw cashew nuts starting in February? I need to finance that. I need to assure my bankers that I'm in business. And one of the ways I can do that is to show them contracts of sale. And that helps as in some way to secure as security to secure the working capital that will come early in 2025. So on the one hand, by selling forward, you're taking a risk. On the other hand, by selling forward, you're creating a mechanism that allows you to secure funding. Now, this doesn't apply to everyone. It'll apply to mid-size and smaller processors for sure, but the very big ones may have different mechanisms to secure their money. Now, when we get to a situation where we have a big increase in price during this year and the prospect of a good crop ahead, and it's always a prospect of a good crop until we know different, but at the moment the prospects are pretty good, buyers may feel less need to buy forward. So if forward contracting is reduced, on the one hand, it decreases the risk, removes a certain element of volatility from the market, but on the other hand, it may well end up restricting the available finance. So it's a fine balance that has to be played in this industry. There are complexities in forward buying. Let's just recap on some of the things. So less forward cover means less market risk and less volatility next year, because buyers will be buying into the reality of the crop rather than an estimate of it. Secondly, we still have a large number of delayed and defaulted contracts on cashew kernels, and many of these are unresolved, and both sides will be trying to resolve those in the course of next year. So it's often done by rebalancing, averaging. If the market falls, the buyers will be in a strong negotiating position. If the market stays as it is or goes up, then the processors and the sellers will be in a strong position. But these delayed and default contracts still cast a shadow over the market. And then the balancing factors. So less forward cover means less risk, but it also means that it's more difficult for many processors to obtain credit. And that credit is needed to buy their working capital. So fewer forward contracts can easily mean that the available cash to buy raw cashew nuts at the start of the season is reduced. And if there's less money, there's lower prices. So looking at the market now, and there is a great deal of uncertainty, some processors have no choice but to make forward sales. Now, what that can do, we've seen in recent years, what that can do, or one of the things that can do, is cause prices to dip down lower than they should be. And that was a phenomenon in 2022 and 2023. On the other side, there probably are buyers who look at the market over the last 2 years and think prices were very low. We got down to $2.45 as the month end. We actually traded lower than that, I think, at certain times, perhaps even $2.35. So some people may look at the current market and say these prices around $3.45, they're the anomaly, and they may wait for a fall, so they'll be less likely to buy. But some buyers balance the factors on processors. So on processors, we said selling forward creates risk, but you might need to sell in order to raise finance. But for buyers, there's a similar argument. Whether or not you believe the market will fall, you may still have to do some buying because you've got to manage your risk. And you may well be working in an environment where you have a minimum level of forward cover. So that means at a certain point, the risks that you're taking in the market, whether you're right or wrong later, doesn't matter. The risks are unacceptable. And therefore you may well have to adhere to the rules and have a minimum level of cover. So for some people, it might be you need to have
Ils vont chercher à avoir un achat de 120 jours
some people
pour
you need
ce
to
serait moins. Et d'autres vont chercher à intervenir en un moment où ils peuvent répondre aux besoins du marché.
higher prices add complexities to the market. So let's look again at some of our markets and let's see what some of this impacts of higher pricing might be. So first of all, we'll start off, we have a look at China. So what we see so far in China
Par voir la
is
situation de la Chine.
a little bit of a slowdown. So the solid line C'est
cette expédition du Vietnam, de la Chine, au fil de voir tout ce qui s'est passé jusqu'en 2024. La ligne en pointe, c'est la même chose 2023. Donc, ce que nous voyons, alors nous allons voir tout de l'année, parce que c'est une nouvelle année qui a été vue, mais nous allons passer sur le mois de mars. Et donc, en milieu d'année, nous avons vu que les achats de 2024 étaient bien avant ceux de 2024 et bien en avant. Et donc, ça, il y a un changement. C'est des changements qui sont partis depuis la fin du mois de juillet. Et donc, depuis la fin du mois de juillet, les expéditions ont connu une réduction si nous comparons cela en 2020. Et c'est pas la même chose. Et c'est pour dire que l'année 2023 n'était pas forcément une bonne année. Ce que nous voyons certainement, c'est qu'il y a une baisse des expéditions pour le Vietnam vers la Chine au cours de cette période. Il peut être envoyé en novembre et décembre au cours des 5 derniers achats avant la célébration de la nouvelle année en Chine. Mais les choses pourraient se passer de cette manière. À présent, nous allons examiner l'Asie de l'Ouest. Alors, l'Asie de l'Ouest est le panier de 7 différents pays qui partent de l'Égypte jusqu'à l'Arabie Saoudite, jusqu'à l'Irak. Tous ces pays dans cette région sont inclus et je prends toutes les expéditions par mois de ces pays, nous les ajoutons ensemble et nous obtenons pendant ce que nous lisons note ici. Encore une fois, la ligne la plus basse c'est de 2024 et puis la ligne brune c'est les données de 2023 lorsque nous voyons pendant l'année 2024, c'est un renforcement.
And it would appear that after an initial reaction to higher prices back here mid-year, demand is still taking off. So it does look as if the higher prices have not affected shipments and demand to those countries in West Asia. Now, what that is it a genuine increase in consumption, or is it some form of stockpiling in expectation of higher prices, or is it something else? Well, that remains to be seen. But the fact is, very strong shipments over the last 3 months to those group of countries in West Asia. Let's look in Europe then and the United States. So starting with the US, 2024, strong performance throughout the year compared to 2023. Every month better than 2023, with the exception of February. But what we are seeing is that there now is a convergence. So the 2024 shipments are coming down more like the 2023 level. So that may be a signal. Now that can be two things. It can be a slowdown of the strong buying pattern in response to higher prices. And I think there's no doubt that that's there. But that's also tempered with a certain amount of seasonality in demand. So whereas we saw last year a fall in September and a rise in October, we're seeing a fall in both months this year, and that's actually the more normal pattern. People may well have been buying last year because prices were low toward the end of the year, and now they're high, they're not doing the same thing, and they're returning to a more normal pattern. So I would expect that we will see US shipments relatively limited. Now, I need to put that in the context that demand in the US market this year has been excellent. Really strong demand, and that won't go away quickly, but the level of growth is likely to slow down based on this analysis and based on past experience. Let's look at Europe, and we're going to take the Netherlands as representative of Europe because the Netherlands is the entry point for most of the cashew nuts into Europe, and they then get redistributed around the continent. Again, we see strong shipments throughout the year. Again, we see this early season doubt, followed by relatively strong shipments. And again, we see the 2024 and the 2023 lines beginning to meet. So that probably signals that there is a little bit of a slowdown of this very positive pattern. So what we are beginning to see is a fast reaction in markets that don't buy forward and a slower reaction in markets that do buy forward because they have contracts to work through. But there's definitely a slowdown in demand in all three markets that we see, but not in West Asia, or what some people call the Middle East. That appears to be continuing to be very strong in terms of its demand, and you can see that reflected in the prices traded there. Fourth factor, the current mismatch between raw cashew nut prices and kernels prices. So here's our raw cashew nut market over the last 5 years or so, and the main feature of that is this big rise in prices during 2024, which we are all familiar with by now. So the relatively steady market, and if you follow the dotted red line, that's an index of the year. It does go up and down a little bit as the quality changes, because quality impacts price, but generally speaking, relatively steady market over 4 years, and then this huge rise in price. Now, what does that mean for processors? So what I did was I took Tanzanian at £52, current Ivorian at £44, Guinea-Bissau at £52, and Tanzania again £52, but processed in Vietnam, and compared the put together prices with the current market. So if we look at the black line, is the average, the black bar in each case is the calculated average price of kernels. It will differ from one processor to another. It will differ on a whole range of topics according to scale, management, markets, and so on. And the blue bars are a calculation of the cost if you just extracted the 320s. Now that's a very difficult calculation to make for a processor, but we take certain assumptions and we've tested them on real numbers, and they are pretty indicative of the reality. So what we're seeing is two Indian examples: India processing Tanzanian, India processing Guinea-Bissau material, that there is a gap between the cost and the market price. Now, it's not the kind of gap that processors are going to be celebrating, but it is allowing them to make a margin. But when we look at products processed in Vietnam, either lower quality Ivorian or high quality Tanzanian, what we're seeing is that the cost price is just about on the market price. That means that by that calculation, processors are going to find it very difficult to make a decent profit based on current raw material costs. So processors, first of all, they need, on the one hand, to quote higher prices, and Vietnamese processors have been trying to do that. They've been struggling to get buyers to follow them, but they need to quote higher prices as their raw material is higher priced. They don't want to write in losses into their books, but they also may want to make forward sales. So if you can make a forward sale today, you may well be speculating that raw material prices will be lower later. And bear in mind, it's not just price. It's not just that if Tanzanian RCN today is $1,800, it's not that it will be $1,500 later in the year. What it is that balance between quality and price. So a lower price doesn't always mean a better deal, because you're looking at quality and price, outturn and price. So when we look at this situation, they may want to sell forward, but that's drawing them into speculation, because it's quite difficult to buy raw cashew nuts on a forward basis from a reliable seller. That creates risk, it creates uncertainty. And there is also the additional risk now that the delays and defaulted contracts from 2024 will have a hangover into 2025. So if you sell today to someone that you have not delivered earlier contracts to, how will that work out next year in the event that the market on kernels was to fall? So this situation is very difficult to manage, and it is creating risk and uncertainty. And not only in India and Vietnam, it's also creating risk and uncertainty. Look at the situation in Tanzania, for example. So Tanzania has seen new processing developing, a couple of really interesting developments, a couple of interesting factories. One or two of those people have joined us on this event in the past. And they're in a situation now where the export price of raw cashew nuts compared to their put together cost in a similar exercise to that you see on the screen is around about break even, and they're left in a situation wondering, should we be selling, hoping we can buy the raw material later, or should we do nothing and wait and hope that the raw material falls? And they're also hoping that the Cashew Board of Tanzania will start to do something to manage the market so that processors can grow and function in Tanzania. If every year were to be like this year in Tanzania, there would be no possibility that processing investment in the country would be successful. So something may need to be done for processors, perhaps an earlier window of access to farmers, perhaps some form of compensation to farmers to allow them to sell to processors. But if the long-term goal of processing is to be realized, then we cannot continue with this situation where there's no margin in it for processors. No one would invest based on those numbers. Fifth factor, Cambodia, subject that we've come to talk about a lot. 5 years ago, we would rarely have mentioned Cambodia, but now we talk about Cambodia every time. Let's look at production in Cambodia. So Cambodia's risen since 2021 to become the second or third, occasionally when India has a very good crop, the third producer of cashews in the world, and that is growing. And it looks like, just talking to producers and talking to co-ops, it looks like they expect better production again next year in the event that we get the right weather conditions, and so far so good. So looking at it now, we see about 824,000 tons exported from Cambodia to Vietnam so far. That's what's been received in Vietnam. We see a 27% growth rate per annum over the last 10 years. And you can see that as production, the red bars, goes up. We see on a very interesting mapping exercise using high-tech methods done in Cambodia recently that the productive area is about 580,000 hectares. Average yield last year around 1.4 tons. Average yield in a good year, and we need to bear in mind last year wasn't a great year weather-wise in Cambodia from a production point of view. So we're going to see in the coming year a couple of things happen. We're going to see, weather conditions permitting, higher yields. So this 1.45 could hit 1.6. And there are individual cases that we've seen of higher yields than that. We've seen 2 and even more than 2 tons per hectare in some cases. Tree densities range from about 140. I've seen as high as 270, but they're not very productive areas, as you can imagine. But generally speaking, very young trees. So when we look, and you can see from this, so production started to spike up in 2021. So let's say that we're talking about young trees planted 2016, 17, 18. That was when the most planting starts to pick up in 2021. So the number of trees that would be older than 7 years is few. And that indicates more production next year. And it also indicates that we could see a crop. I think we could see a crop next year in the region of about 930,000 tons, about another 80,000 tons onto this year's production, something like 8.5% increase. I think that's possible. Now we're getting into the flowering season in Cambodia. The weather will have a big impact naturally, as it always does. But right now we're looking at a good crop next year. And that will, of course, have an impact. Factor number 6, the large Southern Hemisphere crops. And let's have a look. Here we are, the 4 major Southern Hemisphere countries: Tanzania, the black bars, Mozambique in orange, Indonesia in green, and Brazil, of course, in blue. And looking at what's been intaken in Tanzania, around about 300,000 tons intaken by the 12th of November, maybe a little bit more than that by now. 300,000 tons by the 12th of November, it would be reasonable to assume that there's an additional volume to come. Now, we know that there may be significant volumes with the cooperatives. We're not sure how much is left with farmers, although having said that, you would expect that in a high price market that farmers would have sold early. So we have this spike in Tanzanian production. We also have forecasts of a good crop in Mozambique. We know that the Indonesian crop perhaps touched lower than last year, but still a good crop. And Brazil on forecasts remains probably the best crop since 2018. Put all those things together, it has a significant impact. It's the largest crop in these 4 countries combined since 2007. It will up the share of Southern Hemisphere crops to 17%, which is up by about 2%. Significantly, a lot of the Tanzanian material, by my calculation, and it's a changing situation every day, but by my calculation, about 84% of what's been intaken has actually been sold. Shipments are going now. They will arrive December. Some people say early December. I think that's a stretch, maybe mid-December. That means that we will see physical supplies. Now, what we've seen this year is that physical supplies have much more impact on the market in the processing countries than anything else. Much more impact than price change, much more impact than offers. When the physical supplies come in, processors tend to react. And that's an indication of cash flow difficulties. So they need to sell when they have to pay. And that is an indication of cash flow difficulties. It's an indication of some difficult years for processors and a relatively frail position of the processing industry worldwide. And that's not surprising. We've just been talking about that lack of opportunity to make decent profit margins. And of course, that's going to weaken an industry over time. Quick look at Tanzania. Again, strong production, estimates ranging quite high. The official estimate, by the way, is even higher. I'm not sure I buy into the official estimate, which is over 500,000 tons, but they weren't wrong about one thing. They weren't wrong that it was going to be a good crop, and that's the way it's been seen. So what we see in Tanzania is good crop this year, volatility on the weather, but also on the availability of inputs. And it looks like the efficiency of the inputs, import and distribution system, which has been problematic for as long as I can remember, to tell you the truth, but it seems to work this year, and we're seeing the boost in production. And I think we can expect further boost in production over the longer term as farmers get access to inputs, as farmers see reasonably high prices paid for raw cashew nuts. So I think that our earlier conclusion, and if you recall, we had Alfred Francis, the Director General of the Cashew Board of Tanzania, with us, I think it's 3 sessions ago now. He was saying that they expect production to grow quickly. They have big targets. I'm not going to mention the numbers, but they have big targets for production and better inputs distribution. So looking at it, it looks as if Tanzania may be about to enter into a period of fast growth in cashews. Again, production-wise, looks good. Auction-wise, it seems to function. Maybe they've been a little bit lucky this year with the auction in terms of the overall supply situation in the market, but they have managed it well. That seems clear. Let's hope that continues. Farmers have done well. Processors haven't done so well. Now, if you think, okay, 400,000 tons and you need to market that, if it is 400,000 tons, definitely demand will slow down as the auction goes on. I think that's to be expected. But let's say we're looking 5 years forward, and let's say production now is in the region of 650, 700,000 tons. Now you need processors, because you're not going to place all of that material into India or into Vietnam. Not immediately anyway. And at that point you need processors, otherwise you're creating risk in the system. And it seems to me that the board and the government would be well advised to support processors now, to create the precedent and to make sure that those processors are still around when they become critical as production rises. Factor 7, increased African cashew processing. How will this affect the situation into 2025? Well, let's have a look at processing. So I put this together. This is the black bar's installed capacity by 2025. So that takes into account the new factories that have been built in 2024, and to a certain extent, the ability of factories to improve their processing capacity as they become a little bit more mature. We have the figures for 2023, what was actually processed. That's based on figures from processors. I'm lucky enough to visit many of these new processors, and the estimate based on the raw nuts that they procured. So what we can see is that in almost every country, the level of actual processing is way below the capacity. We also see that the level of processing is increasing. And if we draw a chart over a longer period of time, we'll see that the increase is quite significant. So in 2024, we've seen new factories in a whole range of countries: Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria, Tanzania, Benin and Ghana. We've seen the market share of African cashew processors increase in Europe from around about 17% last year to 21% this year. And we've seen an increase in the US from 6 to 7%, but growth in the US for African cashew kernels is much slower. On the other hand, we also see that there are problems with management, problems with marketing, and I think personally that a lot of this is related to the fact that the type of investors who have got involved in many cases, they're not integrated processors, they're not in line with the modern trends and buyers' requirements, and therefore they're struggling. If you see processing as an extension of a trading business, it's really difficult to make it work. What you need to see it is as part of an integrated chain that starts with the producer and finishes with the consumer, and how you fit into that and you make your money from processing, transformation, value addition. But it's for certain that the greater processing capacity in African countries will have an impact. It will have an impact on the trade in raw cashew nuts. So all of these processors will be continuing to lobby their governments for improved access to the supply chain, which may mean mechanisms like windows. So delay in the export of raw cashew nuts. It may mean pricing mechanisms. It may mean, in the case of some countries, subsidies, although those are few. And it may mean different mechanisms. So we are likely to see the growth in African processing. I do not think that, and I'm not saying it will restrict the supply of raw cashew nuts to Asian countries, but I suspect it will delay it. And that looking at the situation today, if Cambodia wasn't such a huge supplier to Vietnam, then this would already have had a huge impact. But the rise of Cambodia and its supply of, as I said, 824,000 tons of raw cashew nuts so far to Vietnam has managed to help Vietnamese processors deal with the changes in the African industry. Now, that's going to continue. Fortunately, Cambodian production is going to continue to rise. African processing looks like it's going to rise. And what we are seeing also is that more and more factories are managing to get themselves in a position where their costs are under control and they're beginning to make a profit. So the increase in African processing is a big factor and it will have a big impact. Factor number 8 is the Burma kernels trade. Burma kernels, in case you don't know, are cashew kernels which are partially processed. So the shell has been removed, they've been prepared, but the testa, the inner skin, remains on the kernels. And there are markets which prefer that product, but usually it's an answer to certain factors. So if we look at Burma kernels, and this has become a big volume business in 2024. At one point, Vinacast mentioned imports to Vietnam of 90,000 tons. It's hard to justify that, but I think Vinacast knows their numbers quite well. If we look at certain countries, in Mozambique in 2023, 56% of the kernels exports were Burma kernels to Vietnam. Can it continue? Will governments intervene? It originally started as a way of managing, or an idea for managing startup factories, small factories in African countries. Do part of the process, supply to another processor who finishes, or send to Vietnam. That's changed. Now it's mainly conducted by the major trading companies. So big companies, big volumes of Burma kernels. And it expanded in 2024. And I think one of the key reasons that it did expand was to circumvent the export regulations in Ivory Coast. So rather than exporting raw cashew nuts, you partially processed them and exported them as kernels. And there was a 10-week period, don't forget. And it was unclear for much of that time when that would stop. But it was at that period during which you could not supply raw cashew nuts to processors in Vietnam. So integrated companies with processing and sourcing operations in West Africa and processing in India or in Vietnam expanded their trade in Burma kernels to circumvent the export regulations. And if you look at the import, you'll see a spike in the import of Burma kernels into Vietnam just around about that period. However, it's problematic. First of all, in most countries, you still receive the subsidies, you still receive the investment incentives, but you don't deliver the impacts. You don't employ as many people as you would. You don't create as much corporation tax income for the government, don't create as much trade in the country. You just don't deliver the impacts that are expected by investment in processing. So governments are supporting one thing, but actually getting another. Now that's been recognized in Mozambique by processors and by the government agencies, and they now proposed to tax the export of Burma kernels. So Burma kernels will attract a tax, I believe it's 15% ad valorem tax compared to cashew kernels, which have zero taxation on export. Burma kernels has had a big impact in 2024 and is likely to have a big impact in 2025. And that brings us to factor number 9, African cashew policy. There is likely to be new policy initiatives of various sorts in 2024 as we come into 2025, impacting the 2025 season. And don't forget, there are elections. Again, 2024 was a big year for elections in African countries. 2025, similarly, you can see the list on the screen. In many countries, there are a lot of cashew farmers, a lot of cashew families, and looking after them has an impact on their attitude come elections. Also, some of the measures from 2024 will still have an impact in 2025, if not directly in the market, then indirectly on buyers' decision making. So when we talk about policy, we often talk about the unintended impacts, those things that were not anticipated, were not expected. So you can make a policy initiative that looks very positive on the one hand, and impactful in a positive way, but it may have unintended impacts. And typically what we've seen is cross-border smuggling. We've seen this trade in Burma kernels. And what we may see in 2025 is a reluctance among certain buyers to commit to buying in Ivory Coast, for example, on the basis that they may well think that what happened in 2024 could happen again. In other words, that they commit to purchasing and the export is interrupted and they don't get their supplies that they had contracted for and in some cases partially paid for, which caused prices to go up, which caused defaults of contract, which exacerbated the entire situation. So the 10-week delay actually has had an impact right through until now and will continue to have an impact for the rest of this year and at least in the minds of buyers into next year. And what is the impact? The impact is a loss of trust. If a government interrupts business in that way once, it's perfectly reasonable to expect that they might do it again. And that can affect contracting for the coming year. Contracting means less money in the system. Less money in the system means lower prices to farmers and a lower evacuation of the RCN. Now, if you want to take that on, later selling of the RCN, if you don't have the infrastructure, later selling of the RCN generally means lower quality. And we saw that this year. We need to make sure, or governments need to make sure that that's not repeated in 2025. Second factor on policy is this whole phenomenon of unrealistic targets. 100% processing by next week, 1 million tons of production by next year. These unrealistic targets, we're going to see them, we have seen them, we're going to see them again, and they just undermine the credibility of the system. They make people think this is all nonsense, which it isn't. Some of these policies are excellent. Some of them have been highly impactful. But the idea that there can be dramatic, almost instant change is unrealistic. And those unrealistic targets undermine belief in the system. And what makes markets tick? What makes markets tick is confidence. And if you undermine confidence, you undermine the market. Third factor, we're going to see further ad hoc and short-term policy making. So watch this space for further levies, export bans, all kinds of things. I think this year there might be a move to try and restrict smuggling and informal cross-border trade in West Africa. That will be a good thing in the long term. How it's done is another matter. So what we can say on policy is expect change. I think we'll see some initiatives in Ghana. I think we may see some in Guinea-Bissau. I think, well, we'll always see something in Ivory Coast because they're always doing something. We've seen initiatives in Tanzania. Other countries, we need to keep an eye on that. Looks like Benin will continue with its export ban and continue to persevere with the current policy. I'm sure we will see an increase in process volume in Benin this year, but the solution last year was that most of the product went cross-border. So those are 9 of the trends. Let's have a look at the 10th. And now for the 10th point, I just want to look at some of the longer term trends. How will the longer term trends impact decision-making for buyers and processors and NGOs and governments in 2025? And we'll start by looking at supply and demand. So from time to time I do this, and what I've been doing recently is for a good client is looking at the projections forward for cashew supply and demand. And as we know, demand has been very strong this year. So when we look at this chart, you've got world production is the blue line. And here we've got a history 2014 to 2024. World consumption is the red line. So earlier we talked about surplus in this period from 2021 once Cambodia came online. What did surplus lead to? It led to lower prices. And now we're getting something of a balancing of that due to the poor crop in 2024. So what I do then is I take the current trend and I look at some of the factors that have given rise to the current trend, such as age of the trees, such as prices, such as the access to inputs in each of the countries, and we try and work out a projection. Now, it's a projection, it's a forecast. This is what might happen, what may happen. But what it's showing is that given normal crops, 2025 onwards, we're again going to be in a position where we have a surplus. Now, it's not a big surplus. It's not like these. It's a relatively small surplus. But it's a relatively small surplus because we're taking into account that consumption will continue to grow at the rates it has been. And one of the major factors in those rates of growth has been super growth in consumption in 2024. We spoke about it earlier. So it does look as if that we will return to a period of surplus, back to a period of surplus, if you like, and that situation will continue for some years to come. Drivers are higher production in Cambodia, West Africa, Tanzania. These are all going to drive production, and we would expect the strong growth in demand to continue, but at slower rates. So can demand continue to grow at the rates we've seen in the last 2 or 3 years, now that prices have adjusted to more realistic levels? And that's the question. And if we just put onto this, we put in price. So again, you've got everything is the same, except we've added in the FOB annual average price. And this upward trend in consumption and that downward trend in price, they've got to be related to each other, I think. And then we're going to see this upward trend in price, and it's got to have an impact, as we've been discussing. If we think about production, we see production growth here, but it takes a little bit longer for production to react to high price. So the driver of this growth in production is this price spike back here, 16, 17, 18. So take 2017 plus 3 years for your first crop, 2020, then you get your spike in production. What was the impact on production during the lower price period, and what will be the impact on demand of the high prices, should they persist, remains to be seen. If you moderate the demand forecast from this straight line, this dotted line, that's an assumption of the impact of higher prices. And now that big gap between production and demand to widen. So again, there's questions about stimulating production. Are we doing enough as an industry to stimulate demand? You know, for example, we have the continent of Africa consumes less than let's say sub-Saharan Africa consumes less than 1% of the world's cashews. This does not reflect the population. It does not reflect the access to the raw material. We are seeing in China, which was an underperformer for many years, a fast growth in demand. Now, will that continue? This is a big question for the coming years, not just 2025. How will normal production impact demand and impact supply? Will it create a surplus? On what we've seen in the past, the answer is yes, it will create a surplus. Let's have a look at another big trend, more specific. Vietnam is the largest supplier of cashew nuts worldwide. Vietnamese processors have had some tough times, and they are looking at more and more adding value to the products that they produce. Now, I don't just mean processing. Now we're talking about roasting and packing cashew kernels. So I looked at the US imports of roasted and our packed means in consumer bags, cashew kernels, and you can see the results. Annual imports, of which Vietnam has a huge share, 86%. Annual imports of roasted and packed products, especially from Vietnam, are growing at a rate of 16% per annum over the last 5 years. So we're seeing sharp growth in this area. That's great news if you're a processor, It means there's opportunity for these products. It means there's opportunity to add more value, employ more people, build a brand, make more profits, if you can access those markets. Now, if you think selling kernels natural is difficult, selling kernels roasted or consumer packed is really difficult. But it's a very interesting trend, and we see this in Vietnam. It does ask a question, though, for me, and I'm being a little bit brainstorming about this, let's say. If Vietnam adds more value, will it decide eventually to process less volume? You can have as big an industry and process maybe 2/3 of the volume that's processed today. And if it's not processed in Vietnam, where will it be processed? Will Africa be ready? Will Cambodia be ready to process those products? Will the raw cashew nut trade switch from an in-shell trade to a Burma kernels trade? Remains to be seen. But it is an interesting trend that will have an impact in the coming years. Other longer term trends, politics and economics. So let's have a little look at some of the things that might impact the market. You could see, again, a renewed trade war on products trade between China and the United States. That's a possibility now. In the past, almonds and pistachios were heavily impacted. If trade in almonds and pistachios to China, or to India for that matter, is restricted by a trade war, by high import duties, by high export trade duties, how will that impact it for cashew nuts? Important factor. Pistachios, particularly if they were redirected into the domestic market in the United States, could well impact the demand for cashew nuts. Economies. Germany's not in great economic shape at the moment. China, there's significant question marks. The UK economy's been in trouble for some time. So we're looking at a number of countries, and they are not the only ones, that have economic issues. Back in 2022, we saw food inflation dent cashew demand in some of those markets. Is it possible the same thing will happen again? There's an election in Germany early next year. That could change things. There's just been one in the UK. That could change things. We probably won't see an election in China for the time being. In the European Union, we could see further economic uncertainty created by, in the case that there would be reduced US support for Ukraine. Europe may well take on the reins, according to what has been said in Brussels. And these factors could lead to a demand slowdown. Now, these are longer range factors, and I'm not saying this will happen. I'm just saying these are things we might need to consider when we look at next year. Still looking at politics and economics, we've mentioned what could cause a demand slowdown. Let's look at the other side. So the conflict, the civil conflict in Mozambique, which is a very sad thing to see, but we're seeing street protests, greater street protests than we have seen for many years. If that continues, could it disrupt the export of raw cashew nuts? I do not know the answer to that question, but it is something that needs to be looked at. We would expect to start seeing raw cashew nuts exported maybe sometime in December. How that situation develops needs to be carefully monitored. As we've talked about, we will see policy changes in West Africa. We may see more supportive policy in some countries, in Ghana, Nigeria, for example. We may see fine-tuning of the policy in Ivory Coast or Benin, or we may see radical change. That could have a big impact next year. Other factor that's just on the horizon now, and this is just perhaps not a huge factor, but it's a bargaining point in the RCN market, and that is the emergence of some phytosanitary issues between West African countries and Vietnam. So the law in Vietnam is restricting the trade in cashew nuts between domestic partners due to certain phyto issues that are not addressed in West Africa. Will that blow up into a conflict? Well, who knows? Will we see in West Africa limitations on the access to early supply of raw nuts from countries like Benin through greater border patrols or closing of the borders, or in Ghana through restrictions that may support processors. All of these things remain to be seen, but these factors could slow down the supply of raw cashew nuts. So there are a number of long-term factors in politics and economics on both sides of the coin that could impact demand negatively, or on the other hand, could slow down supply. So let's try and step back and take an overview of all of these things. We look at demand, supply, price. On the demand side, the question now is, how resilient is demand in the face of higher prices? We've theorized that Indian demand is resilient. We've said that there are strong underlying trends in Europe, in the United States, supporting cashew demand. But we think that higher prices will slow down the growth. So we will not see another 2024 at higher prices, but we may well see growth. We've seen that there has been a slowdown in China. China's become important. 12% of the world's cashews are now consumed in China. And that's the big question really for next year. Secondly, in terms of demand, the demands for sustainable, responsibly sourced cashew kernels are increasing, and there is an opportunity for African countries, or at least origin-based processing from anywhere, to meet that demand. It's much more difficult to meet that demand if you're importing raw cashew nuts, but certainly on nationally grown or regionally grown cashew nuts, processed at origin, you can meet the needs of sustainability and responsible sourcing, particularly for the European market. On the supply side, if we get normal weather, and so far so good, and we get normal crops, that would rebalance supply and demand. We would return to a position of marginal surplus. But the backup of the large carry-out inventory is not there. So if, for example, in 2025, we were to have a poor crop, and I'm not saying there's any indication of that at the moment, but if we were to have that, the backup of the large carry-out inventory is not there this time. It looks as if that will not arise, but we're looking at the weather. We're looking at the weather now in Cambodia, later in West Africa, India, to see how those major crops will fare. Price-wise, it seems to me that on the basis of value, on the basis of retail pricing, the current prices are sustainable for cashew kernels. But of course, unless they go up, raw cashew nuts must come down. The raw cashew nut prices, as they currently stand, are not sustainable in the context of the current market. And if raw cashew nut prices were to be maintained at the current levels, I've no doubt that demand would suffer. So looking at it now, we see a situation where a good outlook for the crop in the coming weeks. So in other words, the right weather conditions and good indications from each of the major supply countries, a good outlook for the crop will eventually drop the prices of raw cashew nuts. But that can only happen after the demand for 2024 and the carry-out stock is filled. And what's happening right now is that demand is being filled from Tanzania. In the coming weeks, it will probably be supplemented with supplies from Mozambique. And thereafter, we'll start to see a rebalancing of the supply. And we may well see a fall in the value of raw cashew nuts. Maybe kernels take a dip, but I would expect them to move up again later in the year. So we're looking at a period of high focus on certain regions, East Africa, high focus on Cambodia to see how flowering goes, the same in Vietnam. And then we'll start to look at India and West Africa for the next crops. So let me pass you back then to Ernest, and let's see if there are any comments or questions that we can discuss in the minutes that remain. Ernest.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jim, and thanks so much for the presentation. and the 10 key factors. Now we have to interrogate them as we head towards the year, and then also to come back to them next year to see how they are impacting. But then we have some questions, and let me also remind our listeners and viewers that you can use the Q&A chat box to put in your questions, or even the normal chat box. You can drop your questions in there, and then we will pick them. But we have a number of questions. I'm going to go about them in an orderly manner using the 10 factors or the 10 key trends you've talked about. So I'm going to go to key trend 2, where you are talking about higher prices. The question is that, yes, the EU appears to have had a slight dip in the annual price average, but then North Africa showed a steep rise, and the average is also showing a steep rise. Where are we going to land in 2025? Would it be any of the years, maybe 2017, or at least somewhere 2013? That is a key question on this particular slide.
So we're looking at
probably if you go back, annual price average and annual demand growth rates.
Okay, so
not this one.
So let me just be clear about something. This is price and demand. This chart.
Yeah, go back. This particular one, I think, yes.
We go back to the world one. Right. So this is price and demand. So what we're saying is that high price has impacted not necessarily the overall level of demand, but the level of growth of demand. So that demand growth slows down in periods of volatility and periods of high price. When we go on,
what level of price are we going to have in 2025?
Okay, well, as I said a few moments ago, I think that the current kernel's prices are sustainable and that we will not see huge drops in price. But I think that there might be a drop in price early in the harvest season as more supplies come to the market. All right, so I wouldn't be surprised if the current price is $3.45. I wouldn't be at all surprised if next year's average price for the year was something like $3.30, $3.35 for WW320s. Now, you could find that that's lower in the early part of the year and higher in the latter part of the year. But I do not anticipate a return to the low prices of 2022 and 2023.
Okay. Back to the same slide. Yeah, this particular one. The questioner, I think, Taiwo, was saying that you had attributed the spike in 2023 to the inflation and then the war on Ukraine. But then he wants to know how about the impact of the blockage of the Suez Canal and then also freight cost increases around that time.
The spike is in demand. The spike is not in price. So the spike is, when we talk about a rise, these figures here, we're talking about rising demand.
Okay, so it's purely the pure demand and not the price. The price is the broken line showing out there. So maybe Taiwo, you can take a very good note of that. Now the next question has to do with the factor 7 or key trend 7. Key trend 7, where you had the major West African producers' production and then processing estimates for 2024. So here, it appears that you left out Côte d'Ivoire, and so the questioner wants to know, with Côte d'Ivoire being the major producer, probably even the highest in terms of installed capacity, how do they fare on the numbers that you have projected here?
Well, the thing is that it's very difficult to put Côte d'Ivoire onto a chart with the others because the numbers are so big.
Yeah, so they want to know the numbers and particularly also the volumes they are doing on Boma Canal in the country. Yes.
So I think that the processing capacity, the equivalent black line for 2025 will be in excess of 500,000 tons, maybe 550, and that the processing capacity for this year probably somewhere in the region of 325,000 tons, and that next year that will rise to over 400,000 tons. So relatively the same thing. What we're interested in here is the trends. So we're not interested in, and at this time at least, discussing the specific numbers. That, by the way, is the topic for the next GME, where we'll have a review of the developments in African processing. So we do expect that in Cote d'Ivoire you will see a continued increase in the volumes processed, and we will see also additions to the processing capacity, but not as much as we'd seen in previous years. The level of growth will slow down a little bit because there is something of rationalization going on there. And that some of the installed capacity, some of the numbers for installed capacity are not realistic, never were. And those factories will not reach, some of these factories are mentioning that they'll process 40,000 tons, 75,000 tons. I think that's unlikely. So Cote d'Ivoire is positive. It's pretty much on the same trend.
But the second part of the question had to do with the volumes of Boma Canal being produced in Cote d'Ivoire, and your thoughts on that, yes.
Tune in the next time and we're going to talk about it.
So we will bracket this for the next GME, where you talk about African cashews in 2024. And
yeah, I have to leave something to talk about the next day.
Okay. Very good. So I'll go now to the 10th, the key trend 10, where you talk about longer term trends, and you are talking about demand slowing down eventually. And then the questioner wants to know how about possible escalation of the war in the Middle East. How would that affect new markets that we have in the Middle East in terms of demand?
Yeah, well, in 2024, the shocking conflict in the Middle East has not yet impacted on demand. We see shipments. I was looking at shipments to the various countries yesterday, and they seem to be proceeding as you would have expected. Now, the market, the Lebanese market, has been for many years under pressure, even before the current war. And it was a great market at one time. I used to enjoy selling in the Lebanon. I used to enjoy visiting, but since the economic problems in the country, that market has been lost. We might expect similar pressure may arise in Italy, but when we look at the real focus area of demand in the Middle East, the Emirates, Saudi, Iraq, Iran, it seems right now that demand is continuing normally. If we were to see an increase in the conflict, a wider war, yes, of course, there would be an impact on trade into those countries.
Now, let me come back to a question in the Q&A box, but then this time I want to read it. It says, when one looks at the retail price in Europe currently, about £12.99 per kg for a mixed bag, unable to relate this with the volatility in kernel prices, i.e. when kernel prices came down to 2.45 per pound, the retail prices in Europe appeared to be still high. Why is this? So he's talking more at within the retail shops vis-a-vis what we are reporting in terms of the price for maybe 320s and the rest, yes.
Well, $12.99 is a great price, by the way, and if you can buy that, you should buy it. Generally, prices are a little bit higher than that. I think that we have not seen a reduction in retail prices. We did not see a reduction in retail prices that matched the reduction in the overall market trend on an FOB level, either in North America nor in Europe. Therefore, we can conclude that the spike in demand in 2024 is not just price driven. It may be driven by other factors. Why our price is not reduced, according to retailers, is that their other costs were much higher. And I think that's reasonable if you consider the impact on vegetable oil prices of the war in Ukraine, if you consider the impact on electricity prices of the war in Ukraine, certainly costs have risen, and therefore retail prices have not reflected the FOB prices. So when we consider the market, we look at the impact of price at wholesale level, but we have to consider that the impact of price at retail level is a little bit different. Now, in the past, in North America, for example, in periods of low price, retailers would promote cashew nuts based on price. But the motivation for buying cashew nuts now is a little bit different in most markets. It's much more related to convenience, to health and nutrition trends, to simple quality and taste, rather than simply price. And there's no doubt that you would expect, if prices were to rise, that we would see some dip in retail demand. And there may well be an increase in price at retail level now that we've seen the wholesale prices go up so rapidly.
Dramani would like to touch more on the Burma kennels and then also the policies relating to that. You talked about the possibility of, or indeed the fact that Mozambique is introducing some levy on Burma kennels. And then he wants to know whether this law will be better or beneficial for Africa, and whether it doesn't reduce employment in rural economies, especially if you look at the fact that most factories, probably with the capacities they have today, may be better off ending at that stage and having the employment at that first leg rather than continuing to the final leg and maybe making some higher costs and losses, which normally we will see. But your thoughts on this?
I'm not a fan of the Burma kernel trade at all. I think that businesses that engage in the Burma kernel trade should be subject to reduced subsidies, should be subject to reduced supports, because they're effectively not delivering what they should or could deliver in terms of the impacts expected. I also think that the Burma kernels trade is negative for African producers because the kernels still lose their identity as African. Short-term reaction to restrictions as a short-term reaction to problems, it's perfectly understandable that people would look to do the most commercially viable thing. But as a long-term trade, I think the Burma kernels trade should be discouraged by governments through their policies. And I think what they're doing in Mozambique, which was done with the agreement of processors, is a constructive and positive reaction to the industry. Don't forget that in Mozambique, they had tough times in processing, and the level of Burma kernels trade, I think, I'm subject to correction on this, but I think in 2023 it went to as much as 56% of the kernels exports, and that's certainly not a positive thing.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Jim. I think that was the last question. And now, just to remind our viewers that the next GME, and indeed the last for the year, will be on the 4th of December, and where Jim will be drilling down this time into African cashews 2024 and looking at processing policy and also sustainable growth. So to look at how the continent is faring, and then I'm sure also to make some recommendations for the coming years. But before we go away, Jim, what kind of what should we look out for in the coming weeks?
Well, I think
I will allow this. Forgive me. I see somebody drop a question in. Normally, I wouldn't, but let me just read it out. Please, what's your assessment on the impact of the RCN ban in Benin? I think you have given that already, but maybe quickly, what do you think they are doing right and what needs improvement? I think you've given it already, but maybe just a few seconds to address it before you tell us what to look out for.
Okay, so the RCN ban in Benin has not had the expected impact in the short term. The impact in the short term has been to encourage the smuggling and the export of cashew nuts informally. Just look at the import figures from Togo in 2024 to destination countries. The RCN ban, as such, in my opinion, is likely only to work when you have your processing capacity up full and processors can pay prices. That needs a partnership between the farmers and the growers and the processors. If you don't put that piece in place, you've no business to ban the export of RCN. However, the overall idea of restricting raw cashew nut export in order to support processing is not a bad one. It just needs, in my opinion, to be a little bit closer linked by an integrated supply chain within the country. Otherwise, you will have smuggling. If you stop the smuggling, you'll have a crash in the price at the farm gate, and that will damage production in the longer run. So, whereas I feel Benin is moving in the right direction, the way they're doing it is complex and difficult.
Nous avons des situations complexes et difficiles. Et je crois que d'une certaine manière, nous pouvons résoudre le problème. Alors, je ne pense pas que la transformation au Bénin cette année, l'année 2020, cela va augmenter en volume. Nous connaissons certaines difficultés, nous connaissons certains facteurs persistants avant les nouveaux projets dont lui sont tirés. Donc, il y a bel et bien des pour et des contre aujourd'hui. Je ne pense pas que la contrebande au niveau frontalier, je pense pas que ce soit une bonne idée. Et cependant, c'est une sorte d'unité de sauvetage pour les productions 2024. Donc, les juristes pourraient travailler sur cette question et il y a beaucoup de choses que nous devons régler avant de dire que c'est une idée réussie, mais nous allons travailler beaucoup plus au Bénin cette année. Et ce n'est pas une situation si complexe que ça, c'est sûr que nous allons revenir dans cette question. Alors, à quoi pourrons-nous attendre la semaine à venir, la semaine à venir? Je crois qu'il y a quelques questions. D'abord, est-ce qu'il va y avoir un relâchement de la demande concernant les noix de cajou, surtout au niveau de la Tanzanie, au mois de novembre, je crois qu'il va y en avoir. Deuxième chose, nous allons voir les conditions atmosphériques dans les pays critiques, surtout pendant que nous attendons la floraison. Quelles sont les conditions atmosphériques au Cambodge? Comment est-ce que nous devons voir les indicateurs de l'Asie du Sud-Est que nous allons voir dans tout ceci? Alors, ce que nous allons faire, nous allons répartir le marché et nous avons donc toutes les raisons d'attendre. Les acheteurs américains travaillent, il y a donc des congés qui arrivent, nous devons essayer de la fin de l'année, donc les personnes vont faire leur bilan et puis ils vont être un peu à l'état du marché. Je ne pense pas qu'ils vont revenir. Et ça, s'ils vont le faire, ça c'est une grande question. Nous allons parler de la création de risques, ce qui concerne dans les affaires internes. Alors, la création de risques, il y a le relâchement de fonds. Combien a déjà été couvert, combien de personnes connaissent ces prix, et puis comment est-ce que nous pouvons connaître tous ces éléments-là. Et donc, il y a des questions auxquelles nous devons résoudre maintenant. Je suspecte qu'en ce qui concerne la couverture à terme uniquement, bien sûr que nous voyons sur la base de l'année précédente que cela et qu'en Afrique de l'Ouest, nous allons commencer les choses de demander beaucoup plus d'enfants en 2025. Dernière question, nous pourrions ne pas avoir cela au cours des 2 semaines, au cours des 6 semaines de politique, ce qui va se passer. Et surtout, nous regardons le Ghana, la Côte d'Ivoire, je regarde le Nigeria pour voir s'il y a des évolutions significatives en ce qui concerne les changements de politique que nous devons également voir en Afrique de l'Est, comment la mise en œuvre des changements, surtout en Tanzanie, comment est-ce que cela se passe au Mozambique, comment est-ce que cela va avoir un impact au marché. Donc, nous atteignons la fin de l'année, à l'évidence, la tendance va se poursuivre, nous allons donc continuer à nous poser des questions pour rentrer dans les ce que nous allons faire, essayer d'identifier certaines environnement, essayer d'identifier d'une certaine manière les réalités qui pourraient avoir un impact sur l'année prochaine. Et puis probablement, nous allons poser davantage de questions et puis essayer de répondre. En tout cas, c'est ce qu'il a dû faire pendant que nous sommes à la fin de l'année. Alors, merci Ernest, merci Alliance des cultures africaines, merci à tout le monde et surtout merci à vous tous qui avez été avec nous aujourd'hui en Zoom et puis à ceux qui vont voir les vidéos.
Thank you very much, Jim. It's always a pleasure to have you, and thanks to all our viewers. And we're looking forward to having Jim again on the 4th of December to talk about African Cashews 2024 and then to see what is the way forward. Thank you, and bye-bye, Jim, and bye to everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
And I use these skills on training my colleagues at the nursery. We now use scions that we prepare in the same day, and we graft. We graft millions of cashew seedlings per year, and some of those seedlings are grafted with scions collected, prepared and collected in the same day. This is a good achievement for us because we use it to prepare 7 days before. So we have an impact in reducing the time of grafting. And I use these skills on training my colleagues at the nursery. We now use science that we prepare in the same day, and we graft. We graft millions of cashew seedlings per year, and some of those seedlings are grafted with science, prepared and collected in the same day. This is a good achievement for us, because we use it to prepare 7 days before. So we have an impact in reducing the time of grafting.